Oh, oh, sorry. Um, let's talk about making your code more readable. So, in this video, I want to talk about 3 ways to make your code more readable. The first way to write more readable code is to stop using so many variables. This is something that I see a lot. I see it in a lot of different code bases in a lot of different languages, so no language is really immune to this. Years ago, it seemed to be the prevailing wisdom that the best way to document your code was to add a number of intermediate variables and give them really long and expressive names. I think that's crazy. I think that the more variables you have in your code, the more complicated things are, the more you're making intermediate variables and stuff, the more the person reading your code has to hold in their head. And every time you ask somebody to hold more in their head, you're getting closer and closer to something that's actually going to cause a problem. Probably the worst culprits for this type of code are map accesses, or when you're pulling stuff out of arrays. And there's this temptation to sort of stick things into temporary variables that have really good names and that are going to make things really clear later on, when often what you're actually doing is you're sacrificing length of your code for some kind of local readability. So it may be a lot easier to understand what that variable is doing in the moment, but by keeping your functions tight and using idiomatic expressions, you can often achieve the exact same thing, but by writing less code and introducing less variables. You have to remember that whoever's reading your code is going to be holding the same variables in their head that the machine is doing. So it may tempt you to think that you're making it easier by calling the user logged in user and differentiating that from the U object that was handed in earlier before you called login on that object. But in actual fact, what you're asking the reader to do is to track more and more state in their brain as they're reading through your function. So reducing the number of variables that you introduce is one way to make it easier to read your code. The second way to write more readable code is to achieve the right balance between too many and not enough subroutines or functions or methods or whatever we're calling them in this particular case. Now, obviously, ever since the introduction of subroutines, the fact that we can break code down into more manageable chunks has been a real gift to the developer community. But at the same time, I have seen code bases where this is pushed too far, and there are a lot of functions that have 5 lines of code, and they're only used once, and it makes things really, really complicated when you have to jump around in a piece of code trying to find all of the different functions and find out what everything means. Generally, there's a main driver. So there's a main flow of execution that's running through a piece of code. If you take the example of a web process, you have a request that comes in, and as that request gets handled, there's a series of things that are going to happen, some branching, and so on and so forth. And in various places, functions are going to get called or methods are going to get called, and we're going to hand off control to those functions or methods. Well, every time you drop down in the call stack, not only is the machine adding another frame, but your brain is adding another frame. So I've had pieces of code that I read where it took me, 10 minutes just to figure out where the other functions were. And that's without even starting to try to understand what they were doing. So achieving this balance and figuring out exactly how many concepts to express in each individual function is a really critical part of keeping your function breakdown readable and understandable for others. So because I know that we all really like hard and fast rules, here's 3 hard and fast rules about writing functions or subroutines. The first is that every function in your system should be called at least 3 times. If you're not using it at least 3 times, get rid of it, inline it. Worst case scenario, you're duplicating the code, you're putting it in 2 different places. The reality is It's probably not going to cause a problem. We're probably not talking about a really big piece of code. But if we are, that leads me to my second point, which is that your functions should probably be between 5 and 30 lines of code. Again, this is just a ballpark. Don't run around the internet saying he said 30 lines of code. If it's 32, it's fine. The thing is that no function should be larger than what can fit on a page. And 30 lines of code fits really nicely on a page in most fonts, in most point sizes. It's easy to read, and hopefully you don't get too confusing with what's going on in those 30 lines of code. Under 5 lines of code, it's really, really hard to justify, adding another stack frame, not from the perspective of performance or anything, but just from the perspective of the person reading and their comprehension, trying to understand, where control happens to be at any given point in time in your code. It makes things a lot more difficult. And the third aspect to building readable functions is limiting the number of parameters and return values. So, again, 3. 3 is good. 3, 4, somewhere around there, parameters and return values. Every once in a while you're going to have a function that has to actually return more. Less is always good. But when you start to have functions that take a lot of parameters, what you're actually doing is you're transferring a ton of state to that other stack frame. And often a much better solution in that case is to define some sort of structure to hold those variables, because what you're actually saying is that state is critical to another part of the operation. So this is a really great place for you to use object-oriented programming, or even in a functional world, to be putting all of your variables into a map or something like that and passing the map as a single variable. It's really important because, once again, those parameters are variables within the scope of the newly called function. So there's something that somebody's going to have to hold in their head as they're reading through your code. So, friends don't let friends write functions with really long parameter lists. All right. The third way to make your code really readable is to spend a lot of time getting comfortable with idioms in your language of choice. All of the different languages have specific ways of expressing concepts that users of those languages come to know and they can recognize very quickly in code. A really good example of this is Python list comprehensions. Now, obviously, you can write out a for loop that adds elements to a list or that modifies a variable. But a list comprehension is built into the language, and most Pythonistas, when they read your code, when they see a list comprehension, they understand immediately your intent. Whereas when they hit a for loop, they're going to start looking at it, and part of their brain is going to tell them immediately that you did not mean to write a list comprehension. So it's going to take them an extra tick or two to understand what's going on. If you use the idioms that are part of your language, you're going to reduce the amount of friction for people who are reading your code. Another place where idioms are important is in variable naming. So there are conventions in most languages for how certain variables are named. Most languages will call files F. You'll use I and J as iterators in loops, K for counting, and some other really classic names like that. In Go, for example, you might call a read closer RC, a write closer would be WC, and so on. And once again, using these variables, and especially sticking to these variable names and not using them for something else, is going to really help people read your code a lot faster. If I'm reading through somebody's code and I see a variable called J, I'm immediately going to assume that we're in a loop. And if it turns out that that J variable is actually a file handle, I'm going to be terribly, terribly confused. So it's important for you to spend time getting familiar with the way that people write code in your language of choice, and especially for you to read a lot of code written in that language so that you familiarize yourself with the common ways that people have of expressing certain things. Things like, opening a file and reading from it line by line, or, iterating over a collection of objects, or retrieving variables from an HTTP request. All of these are things that people have already found a way to express these things, and they've expressed them over and over again. And the closer you are to that idiomatic way of expressing things, the easier it's going to be for people to read your code. All right, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments below what tips and tricks you commonly use to make sure that your code stays readable for others. Subscribe below and hit the bell icon to be notified when I post a new video. Give me a like, a thumbs up. It really does make a difference, and I really appreciate it when you do. All right, that's it for this one. See ya.